Hey everybody, so my name is Mark Simpson-Vos and I'm the editorial director at the University of North Carolina Press. And I'm here today with my very good friend Malinda Lowery. And we're recording this interview during Scholar Strike 2020 on September 9th. And when the Scholar Strike was announced on social media, I knew that the person that I really wanted to spend some time talking with was Malinda, who has been a good friend and my collaborator and fellow thinker for a long time. So Malinda is, among other things, a professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and director of the Center for the Study of the American South at UNC. And Malinda has written all sorts of books and essays, including two books that we've worked on together, the most recent of which is called The Lumbee Indians and American History. And so Malinda, thanks for agreeing to make some time to talk
This
today.
is such a pleasure. Thank you.
So the place I wanted to start, with all of the public attention around the 1619 project, as Scholar Strike has kind of started, one of the points of reference has been this national conversation around legacies of racism and white supremacy. And you and I have talked for a while now about how, if we reframed the 1619 project as a 1492 project, acknowledging at first that there are real limits to using Europeans' actions to set our chronologies for history or anything else. But if we were to set the geographical frame more broadly and set the chronological frame back to the beginning of that settler colonialism process with the Columbian voyages, how would you see that kind of inflecting the conversation we're having now differently?
Well, one of the things that I loved about the 1619 project was how its intention was not so much to reevaluate what happened that year from a historiographic perspective at all. It was to use the tools of documentary and journalism and history to talk about how racism is a structuring force today and since 1619. It was an incredible preview to the awakening that many Americans have had in 2020 around, why structural racism, how racism is a structural force, not just an individual relationship or set of dysfunctional relationships. Racism is pathological in the sense that it's structurally embedded into our society. And so 1619 Project gave us this incredible set of resources to show that, to elevate the knowledge of the public. In that light, a kind of 1492 project could help us understand colonialism in a similar way. And I think, unfortunately, in U.S. history, we have this idea about the colonial period as if it was in the past. And what American Indians and indigenous people all over the world are living in 2020 is that colonialism is still with us. We're still in the colonial period. As long as American Indian and other indigenous populations are not able to exercise their self-determination or set the terms for things like citizenship in the lands that they have stewarded and nurtured for thousands of years, then we are very much still in the colonial period. So in the United States, that takes the form of something called settler colonialism, of course, where colonialism is not just an extractive process. Slavery is part of colonialism, and it's part of settler colonialism in the United States. So when we see those two forces together, we can recognize that dehumanization is endemic to both structuring forces. But colonialism in the United States set forth this kind of epic contest for sovereignty that's still with us. So, and I don't mean to limit us to, of course, the United States. I mean, we're part of a hemisphere. We're part of a continent, two continents. that have relationships with the rest of the globe and really always have had them. So this contest for sovereignty is taking place everywhere. And what we see in 2020 is that 1492 set off a chain of events that requires indigenous people everywhere to continue to assert their self-governance, to continue to assert their epistemologies, their cultural patrimony, their way of reckoning with genocide. And so when we think about 1492, we don't need to think about the harm done to indigenous people in North and South America. We also need to think about how their sovereignty was challenged in unique and enduring ways, and they're still fighting for that. So the really recent Supreme Court decision, the McGirt decision from Oklahoma, that declared that all of eastern Oklahoma is still to some degree Indian country.
That was amazing.
Amazing, like historic decision.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this doesn't happen. The last time something like this happened was in the 1830s.
Yeah.
In the Supreme Court, right?
Yeah.
So this is way different than a social issue that the Supreme Court's going to revisit every 10 years.
Right.
This is an epic determination for the constitutional support provided to Native sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
This decision is deeply connected to what happened in 1492, not just because of the harm done, the eroding of Native sovereignty, but of the ways in which Native people are still able to use these colonial entanglements to sustain their, time immemorial stewardship over their land.
Mm-hmm. That there's actually a use of, in a way, the use of the master's tools, using these legal structures to actually reassert and reaffirm something about indigenous self and indigenous self-governance.
Mm-hmm. And I think most indigenous folks wish we were not in the situation of having to use the master's tools, and many of us don't, right? Many
Mm-hmm.
people prefer to create their own structures, continue to resist, etc. But you have a real need for many different approaches in the complex world of colonialism to sustain our sovereignty.
So for people who have just so the 1619 project, people were really just waking up to the events and then the implications of those events. I think a lot of people don't really know about, or didn't know before the project, about what actually happened in Virginia at that time. It's interesting, right? Because school kids get taught about 1492 and have for decades, longer. But just the piece that to kind of recapture what I think I heard you saying, that in 1619, the events of 1492 were already in place, right? These systems of colonialism, which we think of as sort of beginning with the Columbian voyages, were already in place and had already begun to exert their structural influence by the time we come to 1619. Mm-hmm. And they've exerted their influence not just in Virginia, but in the entirety of the North American and frankly South American continent, and also in Africa, right?
Also in Africa. As Ibram Kendi, and in Europe. Ibram Kendi or Nell Painter clarify in their work, systems of slavery and Christina Snyder in her book, Slavery in Indian Country, systems of slavery have existed throughout most of human history in different ways, but the particular slavery existing outside of a kinship system or a caste system which had deep political implications for mobility, is something that Europeans began to experiment with on the African continent before 1492. Not terribly long before 1492, but certainly I think Columbus imagined himself as a member of this early experiment, what they imagined, I think, to be an innovation in human history, of seizing captive people and selling them for profit and exploiting their labor on their own lands, but then also transporting them across oceans and seas to different continents. So yeah, the what happened in 1619 was we were already at least 160 or 80 years into it. And so we do have to look at what was happening in native North America well before 1619, both around systems of enslavement that native people upheld, which is where Christina Snyder's or Andres Osenda's work is so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But you also think about the transatlantic and European forms of enslavement, which were shaping this ideology that by 1619 takes a particular form in tobacco agriculture in what became the U.S. South.
Right.
And then we have the structural racism that's embedded in the United States.
Yeah.
So,
So as people are waking up, increasingly in the U.S. to this idea of structural racism, one of the things that we want people to recognize is that this broader framework of colonialism is also in play. So for people who don't think as much as you and I do about colonialism and its effects, I mean, so we've talked about white supremacy and its effects a lot in our society over the last couple of months. But if you were to just kind of highlight a couple of key things that are sort of hallmarks of colonialism as they have impacted what is now the United States and specifically indigenous people. You mentioned earlier sort of legal things, you mentioned economic and sort of dispossession of land, but can you just kind of highlight some of those key implications for the
yeah, so,
structures of colonialism?
what we now call police brutality is a large and ongoing theme in Black American life and in indigenous life in the United States. So it helps to include Native people in these narratives of disproportionate effects of police violence. We can analyze the system that creates that violence and its disproportionate impacts in a nuanced way that's helpful to really imagining a way out of it. So when we look at Black and Indigenous communities together as part of part of a police system, a policing system, a way of thinking about society that requires police, then we can see a way forward to defunding, to abolition, to mechanisms of community policing, for example, that are governed by members of the community, not by an ideology that structures those people as their bodies as criminal. And that's helpful, right, to bring these two populations into conversation when we're imagining a new future. When we're also thinking about the past, we need to talk about how race and racism affects American Indians and how in some ways that policing mentality, going back to the Paxton Boys massacre in Pennsylvania in the 18th century, to the Sand Creek massacre in Colorado in the 1860s, to the genocide against the Apache people in the Southwest in the early 20th century. By the time the 1918 flu pandemic comes about, Geronimo as the symbol for this Apache resistance is just kind of, he's his imprisonment is ending,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
So there's a strong series of overlaps here in the carceral state and police brutality and how structural violence has been enacted on Native people and African American people. I think it's sometimes important to students, or it rings a bell for them when I say, can you think of the largest racial massacre in United States history? And they might mention Tulsa, right? They've had good U.S. history teachers. They'll mention Tulsa. If they've been in North Carolina, they might think about Wilmington
Mm-hmm.
and the 1898 coup. They'll think of other episodes of Klan violence, for example, against Black people. They don't typically include large-scale massacres against Native people. in that litany. And so I think if you think about the Pequot War in the 1600s, or the many actions by U.S. militia and sort of local police forces in territories in the 19th century, you start to see that the concept of racial massacre has been heavily practiced on Native people well before the development of the Jim Crow hierarchy, which made those massacres a necessary part of, shoring up Europeans' illegitimate claims to their superiority.
Yeah. I'm thinking about Boyd Cothran's work on the Modoc War in
Right.
Oregon in the 19th century, and how I hadn't thought about this particularly, but the way in which the white settlers in Oregon, the white authorities who were, territorial and then eventually U.S. Army authorities, used the supposed violence of the Modoc people to justify their rounding up and their elimination, the hanging of their leaders. And I'm just thinking about the ways in which today narratives of both African American and Indigenous violence and the idea of sort of pathologies within the community, being used to justify police or authority violence. And I'm just thinking about those connections across time. And so, I mean, we've just kind of zoomed 500 years forward. But so you've written about the 1980s in Robeson County as a really kind of crystallizing time and place to think about how these histories of relation between Indigenous people and African Americans in the context of colonialism, white supremacy, police violence, all kind of manifest. And I just wonder if you can kind of unpack that for people who don't really know a lot about that history, that moment in time where we see these things really coming together in a powerful way.
Yeah, so one of the chapters of my second book, which you were especially encouraging about me writing, it was the most difficult. It's called it my Dementor chapter, because I remember that time period, the 1980s. And I remember what it felt like to not understand the fear that my family and friends in Robeson County felt, but to, observe it and wonder, like the uncertainty, why are my parents so afraid of me going to town with my cousins, And I realize now, of course, after research and oral histories and, other kinds of conversations and archival research, they were afraid because the drug war was alive and well in Robeson County. Robeson County is the home of the Lumbee tribe. It's in southeastern North Carolina, and it's a triracial county in the sense that certainly in the 1980s there were almost equal proportions of white, black, and Native people in the county. So the particular sort of economics of that situation required that Indigenous people in particular seize the opportunities that they had to grow capital, to enhance their self-determination. And one of the ways they chose to do it was through the trade in narcotics. This is part of a long history, of course. Bootlegging and the trade in illegal liquor is dominant throughout Southern history for centuries up to this point. And when you look at bootlegging as related to the drug war, you can see where the state made liquor trade illegal in the early 19th century for people of color, but specifically because the desire was to marginalize these folks economically and therefore politically. So when the liquor trade became illegal, it became illegal because Native people in Robeson County were wielding too much power, using the money that they made from that trade. Zoom forward to the 1980s, and in the 1970s and 1980s, you see a similar pattern with narcotics. You know, the Nixon administration's attitude towards the war on drugs was aggressively positioned to criminalize African Americans. And so in this way, Lumbee and Tuscarora people in Robeson County can be included in that story. And then when you include them and you look specifically at the kinship relations and the reciprocity which facilitated this trade, you see that Native people are using narcotics, the trade in narcotics, to enhance their access to capital. Mm-hmm. Narcotics are not just a means to get high. They don't just, you know, promote undesirable behaviors. They are also a form of property. And people, when they have no access to other forms of property or limited ability to leverage that property for other economic growth, then they'll use what they have. And the connection to the Nixon policies and the war on drugs, of course, is that people's means of survival was criminalized. And the attempt, again, to shore up this false sense of superiority that European Americans have had. Never mind the fact that these economies were in fact serving predominantly European American individuals, right? The consumers of narcotics in wide proportion were not Black and brown people. But Black and brown people were positioned as providing these substances and therefore criminalized and blamed essentially for the ways in which their communities were falling victim to the dysfunction embedded in that illegal trade. So anyway, seeing this structuring force is furthered when you, I think, bring Native people to the center of a story like that.
Right. So you've got this long history of the white community in Robeson County exerting their authority in all sorts of ways, including their authority and control over the economic livelihood of African American people and Indigenous people, and those communities' lack of access to or lack of benefit from their own labor, lack of access to capital, lack of other kinds of autonomy, then kind of collide with this idea of policing and policing of bodies and behavior. And so as you were saying, this sort of, you know, putting these stories side by side, we understand, I think, even more richly how white supremacy is a structuring force, whether we talk about it as a legacy of slavery or a legacy of colonialism. Those things come together in a place like Robeson County. And of course, in a lot of other places around the United States and beyond.
Yeah, you know, it just strikes me again that in 2020, these dynamics are still with us. You know, we have Alaska Native corporations, for example, contracting to run immigration and custom enforcement facilities, prisons, for people who are trying to immigrate to the United States. The access to economic development that American Indian people have been provided by the colonial state is so limited that routinely we are forced to participate in the most marginal aspects of the economy, the things that undermine our own values for human rights, the things that undermine our historical stewardship of our places. So when people say no ban on stolen land, like that's meaningful, you know. That signifies that Native people still have the authority to determine who belongs here. And when that authority is taken away from us, it forces our economies into taking advantage of marginalized spaces that wind up undermining that authority. And so, you know, developing and running ICE facilities is another way of kind of blaming victims of the colonial economy. The victims on the one hand, of course, are people trying to flee violence in their home countries to enter the United States. And the other victim is native economies that are not only forced into marginal temporary forms of economic development, not sustainable forms of economic development, but they are also forced to engage in things that actively undermine their cultural principles.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We've talked about gaming too as another, a kind of issue that comes up a lot when we think about indigenous economies and participations, and the way that gaming is this kind of double-edged sword. Kind of a double-edged sword. Gosh, we could talk all day about gaming as another issue, couldn't we?
Right.
But so we've talked about this idea. I mean, what you gain from this kind of history of relation and understanding the ways in which settler colonialism and white supremacy are entangled, and the impacts that are entangled for African American people, Indigenous people, Latinx people. We could go on. But I'm also thinking about the ways you and I have talked over the years about Native American people, Indigenous people, and the way that they sort of get considered under umbrella of race and racialization, and the way that that sort of loses some really important differences when we talk about Indigenous people. And you've used the word sovereignty on a number of occasions in our conversation today. And of course, we've talked a lot about sovereignty, but sovereignty is something particular, and it's particularly meaningful in an Indigenous context. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the idea of sovereignty plays into the way we think about Indigenous political and social identity, and how there are ways in which this kind of thinking about African American experience and Indigenous experience are not strictly parallel, that there are ways in which we have to keep in mind differences. And one of those, for me, one of those differences really is kind of sovereignty and the way that enters into legal issues, treaty rights, all of those kinds of things. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So just want to sort of acknowledge that the way that the McGirt decision in the Supreme Court recently talks about sovereignty is specifically attached to the U.S. Constitution. What's defined in the Constitution to support native sovereignty is like inherently flawed. I mean, it's just flawed by what started in 1492 and before that. So this European notion of what sovereignty entails is part of what Native people mean when they say sovereignty. They mean the right to construct governments, operate, pass laws, operate systems of governance and oversight, which instill political systems that entail rights. So that's part of what sovereignty is in a Native context. The other part of it that I think is more, it's newer to me and more what I'm thinking about a lot now, is what Nipia Mahuika, a Maori oral historian, talks about in his book, Rethinking Oral History, that Maori sovereignty is separate from neoliberal rights-based citizenship discourses. So the neoliberal rights-based citizenship discourse indicates that sovereignty is based on the consent of citizens, people legally defined as members of the political community. Nipia Mahuika talks about Maori sovereignty as embedded in place and relations that must be nurtured and stewarded over the course of, I mean, not just generations in the sense of our living memory, but from the very foundation of Maori being is their oral history, their oral tradition. And so when Maori people talk about their sovereignty, they are talking about their history. They're talking about their cultural relationships to each other. Citizenship, therefore, and small d democracy means very little in that context, because the only thing that matters, and I'm thinking about his work so much because I think other Indigenous people elsewhere in the world are not going to be exactly on the same wavelength, but we
Mm-hmm.
can all learn from this. I'm learning from it, is, that sovereignty is culturally embedded, it's place specific, and it does not lend itself towards neoliberal rights-based constructions of citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
What it lends itself to is permission and reciprocity. So Nepia makes this marvelous point in his work that no one has citizenship in a nation unless indigenous people have offered that,
Mm-hmm.
have invited you,
Mm-hmm.
have acknowledged your presence
Mm-hmm.
legally within their own systems of knowledge and cultural constructs. So that's the definitions of sovereignty that I would love to see historians work with more routinely, so that we can get to a kind of this is about climate change to me. Sorry to just skip around. But this is about, Zoe Todd, an anthropologist, talks about this too. This is about the reciprocal relationships that are necessary if we don't want Mother Earth to extinguish us. So climate change is not about saving the planet, it's about saving humanity, because the planet will go on. What we have to think about is, what are the right relationships that we have to be in, and therefore the right policies that we need to implement, so that that um, so that essentially Mother Earth, in a spiritual sense, does not want to exterminate us.
Right.
And so when we take Nepia's framework of sovereignty, or Zoe Todd's discussion of the Anthropocene, and we say, what do? We think about citizenship in terms of original stewards of the place giving you permission to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And if that hasn't happened, we're not getting anywhere on democracy. We're not getting anywhere on equal participation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about the way I framed the question, which is, we've talked about this a lot over the years, and yet I still kind of come in with this with this very traditional Western framework, as, I studied political science. So that's sort of the brain that I've got, right? And so kind of leading in with a question that began about laws and treaties and so forth, but you've just demonstrated, like, nope, got to have a completely different set of frameworks here to think about this.
Mm-hmm.
And and one of the things that has sort of undergirded this whole conversation is this idea of relation. And again, this is something you and I have talked a lot about in your work and in sort of the work we're doing together, is how to foreground this idea of relation in history and in what we're doing together in our work as an author and editor. So just to kind of shift gears a little bit, we've talked about decolonizing authorship and decolonizing scholarship in our work together. And when I think about the work that we've done, one of the things I think about is figuring out how to get that kind of notion of relation fully woven into and embedded in the work that you're doing, the way you write, what you write about. And I'm thinking about the work of our friend Jenny Tonpahot, who left us too soon just a few weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about the way that Jenny did this too in her work. And I don't know. So this is like a free association rather than a question. But I wonder if you can, if you were to sort of reflect on this idea of reclaiming your own authentic voice as a writer and a scholar, and thinking about some of the other, writers and scholars who are going to watch this, are there things that come to mind as you think about what it takes to change the way we write, change the way we think, in this kind of decolonized frame of reference?
Yeah, so many thoughts. One is the entry level of saying this needs to be changed.
Mm.
So detaching ourselves from so-called neutral values like objectivity, and understanding the historical evidence which demonstrates that objectivity is a Western European construct designed to privilege that set of epistemologies, above and over and above the epistemologies of other folks who have histories. So recognizing that there's something kind of off about the way we usually think, or the way we usually write, whether it's chronology, whether it's making an argument, there are certainly good reasons to train oneself as a historian in the Western European dialectic framework of history. I've learned a lot. And then it took me a long time, which you were incredibly supportive of and helpful with, to say there is another value here that has to be placed at the center of writing an indigenous history, because that's really what I wanted to do. I wanted to write a history of the United States through a Lumbee lens.
Mm-hmm.
But mostly what I wanted to do was write a Lumbee history that demonstrated how we're attached and entangled in colonialism and how fundamental colonialism is to every American's experience. So with that in mind, you challenged me, and I did my best to put some Lumbee epistemologies at the center of that work. So how do we do that? As folks like me who were essentially raised assuming a lot of truth about objectivity, assuming that in fact that was neutral, assuming that or rather not really reckoning with the ways that white supremacy has benefited me,
Mm-hmm.
or the way that I live entangled with white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at that over the last 10 years or so has helped me see that everyone's process to reinvigorating their work with relevance has to start with self-reflection.
Mm.
And at least, that doesn't have, is not how it always has to be, but at this particular moment in time, with all that's unfolded and the traumas that we're still dealing with, I think that's the evidence base that many indigenous people have, is their family stories, right? It's their personal collections, their family collections, the material culture that has influenced and stayed with them on an emotional level for generations. So Jenny, wrote this incredible book about Kiowa artists, and it's called Crafting an Indigenous Nation.
Mm-hmm.
And she's looking at how material culture and art specifically supports, I think, the notions of sovereignty, which get us beyond this very narrow definition of governance.
Right.
Her work was, she told me this about 2 years ago, told me this story about finding a cradle board beaded by her grandmother in a museum collection, and tracking this down and understanding where it was, and the dialogue with the curators and the archivists around their attachment to the piece and its value to them versus her attachment to the piece and its value to her, was the kind of self-reflection dialogue that really serves us.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, this is what decolonizing historical narratives is all about. You have to de-emphasize that which doesn't serve you, and focusing on the cradle board made by your grandmother in a museum collection as the springboard for this phenomenal book is, that's just the epitome of what I hope will leave our descendants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm thinking about not just the kind of fundamental changing of what constitutes evidence, which is a really important part of what I think you've exemplified in your work, and Jenny did in hers, and frankly, I think is one of the most exciting things about Indigenous studies as a discipline, is really challenging scholars to think differently about the nature of evidence. These are big epistemology questions, right? But also the extent to which it comes back to relation, right? It comes back to understanding that relation and kind of your personal positionality in telling a story is not a flaw that you have to scrub away in the name of objectivity. It is in fact the very heart of what your scholarship has to offer.
Yeah, it's the source or the root. I talk about the pine trees in our territory, the indigenous longleaf pine tree, which we still grow, but you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's mostly been replaced by other plants. You know, the tap root of that pine tree is so deep that it gets to the sources of water well below this sort of very sandy soil in what's now southeastern North Carolina. You know, it drains really well, but it doesn't clump really well to grow a lot of different kinds of things. You can grow many things, but not necessarily the foodstuffs that European cultures
Right.
have valued, right? We do really well growing a lot of stuff, but it's also because we know our ecology. And the pine tree, in many ways, is just this metaphor. It's this symbol of what that ecology is all about. Your root has to be so deep to grab onto that water that the the trunk becomes long and kind of spindly, and it can break, right? In a hurricane, you know, in a tornado, which are not uncommon in our territory, these pine trees fall down, you know, they break. But that root is still there. And so what we have then is a just sort of a metaphorical forest of trees in various different states of life, you know, and this kind of way of relating to our landscape is the the way that I think people need to think about source material.
Mm-hmm.
And so like source in the historiographic sense, the Western European sense, and then, you know, what indigenous people the world over consider to be their sources.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just one place to start.
Yeah. As I think about kind of bringing this conversation to a close for today, and of course it's the joy of knowing that like we're going to keep having this conversation hopefully the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking about that as such a great place to end, because you know there is so much challenge in our moment, and you know this scholar strike event grows out of this terrible year of 2020, and oh, you know, we've talked about centuries of racism and colonialism, and yet there's something that sustains the work. And I think what you've just done is describe what that sustaining force can look like, right? And it's being able to tap deep into your community, into your place, into your people, to find a source of value. And I just, you know, if I were to think about what I would have hoped we could leave people with in a conversation like this one, I can't think of a much better place to land, frankly. Being an optimist, of course, that's
Being an optimist.
as you know I am.
Let's see what changes in the next 5 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks for the conversation today. I mean, I know, you
Thank
know,
you.
it was great for me because it's always great for me, but I hope it's useful to the people that watch as well.
Hope so too. You know, I really appreciate you inviting me to do it, and I look forward to sharing it with others.
Yeah, we'll do this thing that you and I tend to do, which is create something and turn it loose into the world
Right,
and see
turn it
what
loose in
happens.
the world. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks,
Well,
Mark.
thank you, Malinda, and thanks to all of you who watched.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.